It was a warm June night in 1959, the kind that made small-town Alberta feel safe. Stettler was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where children rode bikes until sundown, and where nobody expected horror to live just down the street. But inside the garage of the Cook family home, beneath the concrete floor and oil-stained tools, there was a secret buried in the grease pit, something so grotesque, so unfathomable, that it would shatter the illusion of safety forever. 7 bodies, 1 family, slaughtered in their sleep. The adults had been shot, point blank, with a double-barreled shotgun. The children were bludgeoned with the weapon's blunt end, their small bodies, dressed in pajamas, folded together like broken dolls in the pit. And standing at the center of the storm was Robert Raymond Cook, the oldest son, charming, clean-cut, known to neighbors as a troubled but polite young man. Within hours, he became the prime suspect in one of Canada's most haunting mass murders. He claimed innocence. He said he didn't know what happened. But when police opened the trunk of a traded car, they found something else. A photo album, children's pajamas, new sheets, no blood, no screams, just clues that didn't make sense. Then he ran. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in Alberta history, and a trial that would make Robert Cook the last person ever executed in the province. But the question remains, did he really do it? If you like deep investigations and dark mysteries, subscribe now. This case will shock you. Stettler, Alberta. Population just under 3,000 in 1959. A place defined by quiet evenings, grain elevators, and the steady rhythm of rural life. Tucked in the heart of prairie country, it was a town where families knew each other by name, and secrets had little room to breathe. But that summer, one family, the Cooks, would vanish from the landscape in a way no one could comprehend. Raymond Cook was a hard-working man, 53 years old, employed in construction, and known for his no-nonsense demeanor. He'd remarried after the death of his first wife, and with his second wife, Daisy, 37, he had 5 more children. They lived in a modest house on a quiet street. Their garage doubled as a workspace, the kind of place where a man might tinker with an engine late into the night. The children, Gerald, Patrick, Christopher, Kathy, and Linda May, ranged in age from 9 to just 3 years old, bright-eyed, energetic, and loved deeply by teachers and neighbors. They wore matching pajamas. They had Saturday routines. In many ways, they were the ideal post-war Canadian family. But then there was Robert. Born July 15, 1937, in Hanna, Alberta, Robert Raymond Cook was Raymond's son from his first marriage. He grew up estranged from his father, spending years in and out of reformatories for petty crimes. By the time he was 21, he had a criminal record that included theft, forgery, and impersonation. Yet, he also had a side that drew people in. He was articulate, clean-cut, and at times, eerily calm under pressure. After his release from prison in 1959, Robert returned to Stettler to live with the Cook family. Neighbors noticed a change. He was quieter, sometimes brooding, but no one expected violence. Not in this family, not in this town. Just days before the massacre, Robert visited car dealerships around Alberta, trying to trade in his father's station wagon for something flashier, a 1959 Impala convertible. When questioned, he told different stories, that the family had gone to British Columbia, that he was authorized to make the deal, that everything was fine. It wasn't. The town of Stettler had no warning, no screams, no missing persons report, only silence and the sudden absence of an entire household. Then came the smell. June 28, 1959. The Cook house sat still in the early morning light. No movement, no noise. The neighbors had begun to notice the silence. No children playing in the yard. No sign of Raymond or Daisy at church. The house looked untouched, but it felt wrong. It was local police who first opened the garage. The station wagon was gone, but the air was thick, with an acrid, almost metallic scent. One officer walked toward the grease pit, a deep trench built into the concrete for vehicle repairs. When the lid came off, a swarm of flies exploded into the air. Inside, packed in layers, were the remains of all 7 members of the Cook family: Raymond Cook, Daisy Cook, and their 5 children: Gerald, Patrick, Christopher, Kathy, and Linda May, each one in their nightwear, each one murdered. Raymond and Daisy had been shot. Close range, double-barreled shotgun blasts to the head and chest. The children's bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma. Investigators would later determine that the weapon's butt had been used, swinging down with crushing force as they slept. The sight was incomprehensible. The grease pit, meant to hold oil and parts, now held an entire family, folded and buried under blankets, bedding, and clothing, in a grotesque attempt to hide the evidence. Blood had soaked through the concrete. A hammer was found nearby, shell casings. One child's hand still clutched a piece of their pajamas. Back inside the house, investigators found signs of staging, beds neatly made, toys untouched, no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no shattered doors. Whoever had done this had time to clean, to think, to place each body deliberately. And there was something else, missing. The 1958 Chevrolet station wagon, gone, along with documents, personal effects, and a photo album that would later resurface miles away in a completely different town. That morning, the entire province of Alberta woke to a nightmare. News spread quickly. 7 dead in a quiet family home. No warning, no survivors, no suspects, yet. But one name was already on the lips of investigators, Robert Raymond Cook. Because he wasn't just missing, he had been arrested days earlier for trying to trade that very same station wagon. So far, police had no motive, no witness, and no confession. But the one thing they had was a trail, and it was leading straight to the Cook family's eldest son. It began with confusion, then suspicion, and finally, horror. Before the bodies were even discovered, Robert Raymond Cook had already landed on police radar. Days earlier, he'd been arrested in Edmonton for fraud. The charge: attempting to trade his father's 1958 Chevrolet station wagon for a brand new 1959 Impala convertible. The car dealer was skeptical. The young man in front of him, dressed neatly and speaking confidently, claimed his family had suddenly relocated to British Columbia, and he was authorized to make the trade. But when the dealer asked for contact with the vehicle's owner, Robert stumbled. There was no address, no letter, no phone number, just a photo album, some pajamas, and fresh sheets in the back of the station wagon. To the Edmonton police, it felt off, but not yet criminal. That would change once Stettler police opened the Cook family's garage. The moment the 7 bodies were recovered from the grease pit, a chain of events snapped into motion. Robert, already in custody, was immediately reclassified from fraud suspect to murder suspect. But what came next would only deepen the mystery. Under interrogation, Robert told police he hadn't seen his family in weeks. Then, hours later, he claimed they were simply on vacation in British Columbia. Days later, he insisted they were alive and would be furious when they found out he was being accused. He showed no signs of panic, but no grief either. Still, the evidence against him was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints found at the scene that clearly linked him to the weapon. No eyewitnesses, no direct confession, and yet all signs pointed inward. He was the last known person to see them alive. He had tried to assume control over the family's property, and most damning of all, he ran. On July 11, 1959, while awaiting a psychiatric evaluation at the Ponoka Mental Institution, Robert escaped. It was a coordinated, calculated move. He slipped away from the facility at night, vanishing into the dark farmlands of central Alberta. What followed was one of the largest manhunts the province had ever seen. Over 100 officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were mobilized. Helicopters swept the skies. Police dogs combed through thick brush and dense forest. Tips flooded in from surrounding towns. People locked their doors for the first time in years. For 8 days, Robert evaded capture. Then, near the small community of Bashaw, just miles from his family home, he was found, exhausted, starving, and hiding in a farmhouse. He surrendered without resistance. Back in custody, he was formally charged with the murder of his father, Raymond Cook. Not all 7, just the patriarch. Prosecutors knew that convicting him on one count might be easier than pursuing all 7. The trial began with a town on edge. Inside the courtroom, Robert appeared calm, unshaken, some said arrogant. He continued to proclaim his innocence, calling the accusations insane. His defense attorney, David McNaughton, built his case on doubt. He argued that the Crown's evidence was circumstantial at best, that Robert had shown genuine shock upon hearing of his family's deaths, and that no murder weapon had ever been conclusively tied to him. But the jury saw it differently. In November 1959, Robert Cook was convicted of murdering his father and sentenced to death. Then came a twist. The conviction was overturned on appeal due to a technical error in the trial proceedings. A second trial was ordered, but it would lead to the same result: guilty. He would be hanged at Fort Saskatchewan Provincial Jail on November 15, 1960. As the date approached, protests emerged. Supporters of Robert argued that Alberta was about to execute a man based on assumption, not fact. Psychiatrists debated whether Robert suffered from a dissociative disorder, suggesting he might have repressed memories or fractured mental clarity. Even now, decades later, that question haunts the record. Did Robert Cook murder his family in a moment of rage? Or did he truly not remember? So far, police had no leads, no motive, and no suspect. But now, they had a conviction, and a man who never once admitted guilt. The conviction was final. The sentence was death. But the story was far from over. What seemed like an open and shut case began to unravel, not in the courtroom, but in the public's mind. As the execution date drew near, cracks in the narrative widened. Robert Cook had never confessed, not once. Through 2 trials, months in custody, and countless hours of interrogation, he maintained the same calm, almost eerie refrain: "I didn't kill them." And then came the inconsistencies. First, the lack of physical evidence. There was no murder weapon ever found in Robert's possession, no fingerprints on the shotgun or hammer, no bloodied clothes, no eyewitnesses placing him at the scene during the estimated time of the murders. The crime had been methodical, precise, and brutal. But Robert's known behavior, erratic, impulsive, disorganized, didn't align with the cold logic of the killings. Second, the behavior of the accused. According to the nurses at the Ponoka Mental Institution, Robert's response upon hearing of his family's deaths had been one of visible, genuine shock. He'd cried, shaken, repeatedly asked, "All of them?" It wasn't the reaction of a remorseless killer. It was human. Then, David McNaughton, his defense attorney, revealed what he believed was the greatest flaw in the prosecution's case: motive. Robert had a criminal past, yes, but murder, especially of 7 family members, was a psychological leap. There was no financial windfall awaiting him, no history of violence against his siblings or father, no diary entries, threats, or signs of escalating rage, and perhaps most haunting of all, the escape. If Robert was truly the cold-blooded killer authorities claimed, why did he flee only after being sent for a psychiatric evaluation? Why not run the moment the bodies were found? Why surrender peacefully after evading one of the largest manhunts in Alberta history? In the final days before his execution, letters poured in. Citizens, journalists, even clergy voiced concern. Is this justice, one editorial asked, or convenience? Others pointed to Canada's crumbling trust in capital punishment, using Cook's case as a rallying cry. Some even suggested an alternate theory. What if the real killer had used Robert's past as cover? What if someone else with access to the house and knowledge of the family's routines had committed the crime, and Robert's odd behavior was the perfect distraction? Of course, there was no proof of that. Just whispers, just doubt. But that doubt, it never left. This twist changed everything. Comment below. Who do you think did it? November 15, 1960. The sun hadn't risen yet when the guards entered Robert Raymond Cook's cell at Fort Saskatchewan Provincial Jail. He had spent the night awake, pacing, praying, writing letters no one would ever read. At 9 a.m., he walked his final steps. He was 23 years old. Outside, protesters stood in silence. Journalists waited in bitter cold. Across Alberta, radios carried the news. Robert Cook would be the last man executed in the province. The gallows, hidden behind high stone walls, had been prepared the night before. He was offered a blindfold. He declined. When asked for final words, Robert spoke clearly. "I am innocent. I bear no malice toward anyone. I am ready to die." The trapdoor opened. The rope snapped tight. It was over in seconds. But outside those walls, nothing was over. The trial had ended. The sentence carried out. But for many, questions remained. Why hadn't he confessed, even in his final breath? Why wasn't a second killer ever seriously considered? Why were the murders so precise, so brutal, yet without any forensic confirmation of Robert's direct involvement? To some, the state had executed a monster. To others, they'd silenced a scapegoat. Even decades later, legal scholars would revisit the case, calling it one of Canada's most disturbing examples of justice without proof. In 2017, a review of wrongful convictions in Canada mentioned Cook's name in the same breath as other infamous controversial cases, always with the same caveat: no one knows for sure. No one will. The last known person to see the Cook family alive was executed. The last words spoken were of innocence, and the garage in Stettler, where 7 lives were taken, was eventually torn down. But the stain never left. In the quiet town of Stettler, Alberta, the echoes of the Cook family massacre never fully faded. Neighbors who once shared Sunday dinners with the Cooks stopped speaking of that summer. Children who had played with Gerald, Patrick, and Christopher grew up under the shadow of the crime. The Cook house was sold, the garage torn down, and yet, space where the grease pit once sat remained untouched, like a scar beneath the surface. For the justice system, the Cook case became a turning point. Robert's execution marked the end of an era. In the years following his death, a national debate exploded over Canada's use of capital punishment. Critics pointed to the Cook case as a grim example of irreversible justice delivered on uncertain ground. In 1976, capital punishment for civilian crimes was abolished in Canada. His lawyer, David McNaughton, would later describe the trial as the most troubling of his career, not because of the outcome, but because of what he couldn't prove. There was no peace in it, he told reporters years later, only silence. Family members who survived, distant cousins, old friends, never spoke much to the press. There were no memorials, no anniversaries, only closed doors and quiet grief. But the questions remained. Books were written, documentaries produced. Each retelling added new doubt or new horror. Was Robert a cold-blooded killer, calmly manipulating the legal system, or a mentally fractured man swept into a tragedy he couldn't control? One detail often overlooked still chills those who study the case. In the photo album found in the traded car, the one Robert had carried with him, there was a picture of the whole family smiling in the backyard. He had kept it with him, even as he ran. Some say justice was done. Others say the real killer was never found. Robert Raymond Cook died with a noose around his neck and a secret in his silence. He never confessed, never explained, and with him, the truth may have died too. In the decades since, the Cook family has become more than a tragedy. They've become a cautionary tale of trust, of justice, of how a single night can destroy everything, and of how a town, a province, even a country, can change forever. From the weight of one unanswered question, what really happened inside that garage? Hit subscribe and watch our next story, one even darker than this.